The crystal chandeliers of Lark Hall Manor rattled as I dropped to one knee, the velvet of my breeches pressing into the cold, polished marble. In my trembling hand, the Star of the East diamond, a stone worth more than the entire county of Oswestry, blinded the elite guest with its jagged, icy light. I was Peregrine Vane, the golden heir to a shipping empire that moved the world's wealth. But in that moment, I felt like a beggar. Before me stood Zenobia Pyke, a scullery maid with a streak of soot across her cheek and a spine of forged iron. She was dressed in tattered wool, smelling of wood smoke and lye, yet she looked down at me with the dignity of a fallen empress. "Take it," I whispered, my voice cracking beneath the weight of 300 years of family pride. "Take it and never scrub a floor again. Be my wife, and I will pay my inheritance just to keep you warm." The ballroom went deathly silent. The clinking of champagne flutes stopped as if the air itself had frozen. My father, the Earl of Vane, stood at the edge of the dais, his face turning a bruised purple of suppressed rage. Zenobia didn't blink. She didn't look at the diamond that could buy her 1,000 lives. She looked through me, her eyes like a frozen lake, treating the man who owned her contract as if I were nothing more than a passing shadow. Without a single word, she turned her back on the fortune, the name, and the future I offered. She picked up a bucket of gray, dirty water and walked out of the ballroom. The silence that followed was the sound of a dynasty cracking. The silence was broken by the sharp, rhythmic clack of my father's cane. Bartholomew Vane descended the stairs, each step a judgment. "If you follow that peasant through those doors," he hissed, his voice a low vibration of pure venom, "you are no son of mine. You will leave this house with nothing but the clothes you wear and the shame you've invited." I looked around at the laughing faces of the town, the sneering aristocrats who saw Zenobia as furniture. I looked at the Star of the East sitting in its velvet box, the symbol of my golden cage. With a sudden, violent motion, I hurled the diamond into the roaring fireplace. A collective gasp echoed as the most expensive stone in England disappeared into the embers. "Then I am a nameless man," I replied, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't wait for his response. I turned and ran, not toward the grand entrance, but toward the damp, dark corridors of the servants' quarters. Behind me, I heard the Earl roar for his guards to intercept me. I was a fugitive in my own home, racing through the stone veins of the manor to find the woman who had just rejected the world for the sake of her silence. My life as a lord ended in that hallway, but for the first time, I felt the blood of a man coursing through my veins. I would find her, even if I had to tear Lark Hall down stone by stone to reach her. The basement of Lark Hall was a labyrinth of shadows and the smell of damp earth. I found her in the forgotten library, a room where the air was thick with the dust of centuries. Zenobia wasn't hiding or weeping. She sat at a heavy oak table, illuminated by a single, guttering candle. Before her lay a forbidden, wax-sealed volume of ancient common law, its pages brittle and yellowed. "You can read," I gasped, leaning against the doorframe to catch my breath. She didn't look up, but her slender finger traced a line of Latin text that detailed the illegal seizure of provincial lands. She pointed to a signature at the bottom of a royal decree. It was the name Altamorn. Underneath it, someone had crudely overwritten the name with a forged Vane seal, the ink darker and more aggressive than the original. I stepped closer, my heart stopping as the truth took shape. The Altamonts were a noble house thought extinct, their lands swallowed by my ancestors a century ago. Zenobia wasn't just a maid who had wandered into our service. She was the rightful owner of the very ground Lark Hall sat upon. She had been scrubbing the floors of her own stolen palace. She finally looked up at me, her gaze heavy with a terrifying, soulful pity. She hadn't asked for my hand because she already knew that everything I owned, the ships, the manor, the diamond, was built on the blood of her kin. I was the heir to a theft, and she was the silent witness to my family's greatest crime. Morning arrived with the gray, oppressive weight of a storm. The peace of the library was shattered by the heavy boots of the constables. A piercing scream echoed from the kitchens, a sound of manufactured terror. We were dragged into the courtyard where my father stood, flanked by his valet. The Vane family signet ring. The High Constable announced, holding up the gold band, found in the pocket of the scullery maid's apron. My heart plummeted. It was a plant, a clumsy but lethal frame to get rid of her. As the officer reached for Zenobia, his hand bruising her thin arm, I stepped between them. I felt the heat of 1,000 ancestors' pride boiling over. I struck the officer's hand away, my own knuckles bleeding from the force of the intervention. She didn't steal it. I roared, the scandal rippling through the gathered staff like wildfire. I gave it to her. I placed it there myself as a token of our betrothal. The Earl's face went white. By claiming I had given a common made the family's legal seal, I had committed social suicide. I had effectively signed away my legal right to lead the Vane shipping empire, as the law forbade the transfer of the seal to anyone outside the direct bloodline without a sanctioned marriage. I saw the triumph in my father's eyes. He didn't care about the ring. He wanted me broken. But as I looked at Zenobia, she wasn't looking at the ring. She was looking at my bleeding hand with an expression of profound, agonizing debt. I was locked in the North Tower study to await what my father called a sanity hearing. He intended to have me declared unfit so he could retain control of the empire. I paced the room like a caged animal until my boot caught on a loose floorboard near the desk. Beneath it lay a hidden compartment. Inside was a leather-bound ledger titled The Wyvern Erasure. My breath hitched as I flipped the pages. It wasn't just a record of land. It was a diary of a massacre. It detailed how Zenobia's family, the Altamonts, hadn't died in a tragic fire as the history books claimed. They had been systematically hunted by a cabal of merchants led by the Vanes. My father had paid for the oil. My grandfather had paid for the matches. Every ship in our harbor was bought with Altamont gold. I realized then why Zenobia asked for nothing. She wasn't being humble. She was waiting for justice. She knew the Vanes owed her a debt that could only be paid in blood and the total collapse of our name. The emotional weight of it crushed me. I had spent my life preening in stolen feathers. I clutched the ledger to my chest, realizing that I was the only one who could provide the evidence she needed. But to give it to her meant destroying my father, my heritage, and my future. I didn't hesitate. I hid the ledger inside my shirt, the sharp edges of the leather cutting into my skin, a physical reminder of the truth I was now sworn to protect. The news of my betrothal to a maid spread through London like a plague. My cousin, Octavia, a woman whose ambition was as sharp as her corsets, saw an opportunity to climb the ruins of my reputation. She whispered to the penny dreadfuls and the high society papers that Zenobia was no maid, but a French spy, an agent of chaos sent to seduce the Vane heir and dismantle the British Navy's supply chain. By afternoon, a mob had gathered at the iron gates of Larkhall. They carried torches and effigies, their voices a low, rhythmic chant for blood. "Bring out the witch!" they screamed, their faces distorted by the flickering orange light of the pitch-soaked wood. I broke out of my tower room, dodging the guards, and found Zenobia standing by the gatehouse, staring at the mob with a strange, detached calm. A stone sailed through the air, shattering a window behind her. Without thinking, I threw myself in front of her, my body a shield against the raining debris. A jagged rock struck my shoulder, the pain radiating through my spine, but I didn't move. "Fools!" I shouted at the crowd. "She is more English than any of you." But they couldn't hear me over the roar of Octavia's lies. Zenobia reached out, her hand hovering just inches from my wounded shoulder. She didn't touch me, but the warmth of her presence was the only thing keeping me upright as the mob pressed against the gates, demanding a sacrifice I wasn't ready to give. Among the crowd was Lord Thistlewood, a man who had long coveted the Vane shipping routes in my father's favor. He stepped forward, his silk-top hat gleaming in the torchlight. "Move aside, Vane," he sneered, pointing a silver-headed cane at Zenobia. "You've lost your wits over a mute dog. If she won't speak for herself, she has no place in a civilized land." The insult hit me harder than the stone had. Before the sentence had even finished, my hand moved of its own accord. My glove struck Thistlewood's cheek with a wet, sharp crack. The mob went silent. "Pistols at dawn," I barked, my voice echoing off the stone walls. On the heath behind the old chapel. Thistlewood laughed, a cold, metallic sound. He was a known marksman, a man who had killed 3 men in duels over less. I had never fired a dueling pistol in my life. My hands were meant for ledgers and silk, not lead and gunpowder. I was walking into a death sentence. As the crowd began to disperse, sensing the coming violence, Zenobia finally moved. She grabbed my sleeve, her fingers digging into the fabric. Her eyes were wide, pleading, shimmering with the first sign of raw emotion I had ever seen from her. She shook her head violently, her lips moving as if trying to form a word that wouldn't come. She didn't want my protection if it meant my death, but I couldn't back down. My honor was the only thing I had left to give her. The night before the duel was a fevered dream of preparation. I sat in the small, damp gardener's cottage where I had taken refuge. Zenobia was there, cleaning my wounded shoulder with cold water. As she moved to reach for a bandage, her own collar slipped. My breath caught in my throat. Branded into the pale skin of her shoulder was a jagged, ugly crest, a wyvern being crushed by a lion. My blood ran cold. That wasn't a family mark. It was the traitor's brand, used only for those accused of high treason against the crown. It was a mark that stripped a person of their humanity, making them legal prey for anyone to kill. I realized the stakes were infinitely higher than a simple duel. If I won against Thistlewood, I wasn't just defending a maid's honor. I was declaring open war on the king himself, who had sanctioned that brand against the Altamont bloodline. Thistlewood knew about the mark. That was why he felt so bold. He wasn't just fighting a rival. He was cleansing the land of a mocked traitor. I looked at Zenobia, who quickly pulled her shawl over the brand, her face flushed with shame. I took her hand, my fingers tracing the callus on her palm. "I don't care what the king says," I whispered. "I know who you are." She looked at me then, and for a fleeting second, the wall of her silence seemed to tremble. I knew then that I wouldn't just fight Thistlewood. I would fight the entire world to keep that brand from being her end. The dawn was choked with a thick, yellow fog that smelled of sulfur. I stood on the heath, the pistol heavy and cold in my hand. Thistlewood stood 40 paces away, a predatory smile on his face. But the duel never happened. Before the count could begin, the sound of galloping horses tore through the mist. It wasn't my father's guards, but the High Provost and a squad of Royal Dragoons. They didn't come for me. They swarmed Zenobia, who had followed me to the heath in secret. "Zenobia Pyke," the provost bellowed. "You are under arrest for identity theft, high treason, and the concealment of a traitor's brand." They dragged her toward a black carriage, the chains rattling against the frozen grass. I ran toward them. But the Earl, my father, stepped out from the shadows of the chapel. "Let her go, Peregrine," he said coldly. "She is a dead woman walking." In a moment of desperate clarity, I realized there was only one legal loophole left. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my last remaining bank drafts, the liquid assets I had secured before the Earl could freeze them. "I buy her," I screamed, thrusting the papers at the provost. "Under the Indenture Act of 1820, I purchase her contract and her debt to the state. She is my legal property, and you cannot execute a man's property without a trial by his peers." The provost hesitated, looking at the gold. I had just used my entire future to buy her life, making myself her legal owner, a cruel irony to save her from the noose. The interior of the prison carriage was a cage of shadows. Because I had purchased her indenture, I was allowed to ride with her to the holding facility in Blackfriars. Zenobia sat across from me, her wrists bound in iron. She didn't look at the floor anymore. She looked at me with an intensity that burned. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, jagged piece of charcoal she must have snatched from the cottage hearth. She took my hand, the one that had held the pistol, and wrote a single word across my palm in thick, black strokes. "Flee." I looked at the word, then at her. She was telling me to leave her, to take what little I had left and run before my father's reach strangled me too. I felt a surge of defiant love so strong it made my head swim. I closed my hand into a fist, crushing the charcoal dust, locking her command away where it could never be followed. "I have nowhere to go," I whispered, leaning forward until our foreheads nearly touched. "Where you are not. You are the only home I have left, Zenobia." For the first time, A single tear escaped her eye, carving a path through the soot on her cheek. She didn't write anything else. She simply leaned her head against my shoulder, the chains clinking softly as the carriage jolted over the cobblestones. I realized then that while I was her legal owner on paper, I was the one who was truly enslaved to a woman who had asked for nothing, yet had taken everything I ever was and rebuilt me into something better. A week into our confinement in the low-rent district of London, a roar of orange light filled the night sky. I ran to the window of our cramped room to see the horizon glowing. The Vane warehouses of the East India docks, the heart of our family's wealth, were being consumed by an unnatural fire. I watched as 3 generations of shipping logs, silk, and spices turned into a pillar of black smoke. It wasn't an accident. My father had set the fire himself. By morning, the papers were screaming a new headline: Peregrine Vane accused of insurance fraud, Ed Burns' own legacy to fund traitorous lover. The Earl was burning his own fortune just to frame me, ensuring I would be bankrupted and hunted by the law. He would rather lose everything than let me keep Zenobia. We stood on the roof of the tenement, watching the embers fall like black snow. The heat was so intense it blistered the skin on our faces. I felt Zenobia's hand slip into mine. She didn't look afraid. She looked vindicated. She knew this was the true face of the Vane legacy: destruction at any cost. I watched my future as a log turned to ash and felt a strange sense of relief. The golden cage was gone. I looked at Zenobia, her face illuminated by the fire that was supposed to destroy us. "Let it burn," I whispered. "There is nothing in those warehouses worth more than the truth." We stayed there until the sun rose, 2 ghosts standing amidst the ruins of a burning empire. The ruins of the docks were still smoldering when a man emerged from the fog. He was dressed in a heavy, salt-stained coat, his face a mask of calculated brutality. He called himself Jethro, a name that sounded like grinding stones. He walked straight up to the constable guarding our tenement and produced a weathered, wax-sealed document. "I've come for my wife," he announced, his voice a low, mocking growl. My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces as he held up a marriage certificate. It was dated 4 years ago, signed by a curate in a northern parish, and it bore Zenobia's name. "She's a runaway," Jethro sneered, looking at Zenobia with a hunger that made my skin crawl. "And I've come to collect what's mine." I looked at Zenobia, waiting for her to deny it, but she simply stared at the man with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. She recoiled as if he were a serpent. I stepped in front of her, my hand on the hilt of the small knife I now carried. "She goes nowhere with you," I said, my voice trembling with rage. Jethro laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "The law is the law, little lordling. You might own her contract, but a husband's right precedes a master's." He stepped closer, the smell of cheap gin and decay clinging to him. I felt the world tilting. Had his silence been a shield against this man? Was I just another man trying to claim a woman who belonged to a knight May? I couldn't sleep. The image of that marriage certificate burned in my mind. I waited until Jethro retreated to a nearby tavern to drink away his anticipation. I followed him, staying in the shadows, watching as he met with a man in a dark cloak. It was my father's valet. I saw a heavy bag of gold change hands. My heart leaped. It was a setup. I waited for the valet to leave. Then I didn't attack Jethro with my fists. I was a Vane. I knew that the best way to destroy a man was to take his leverage. I noticed Jethro was bragging to a group of dockworkers about his noble wife and how he'd cheated them out of their wages to buy his new suit. I saw the anger in their eyes, men he had worked with and betrayed. I stepped out of the shadows and whispered a few choice truths to the biggest man in the room. I showed them the bag of gold Jethro had hidden in his coat. Within minutes, the tavern erupted. The dockworkers Jethro had cheated didn't care about a marriage certificate. They cared about the gold. As they dragged him into the alley to discuss his debts, I snatched the certificate from his fallen coat. I took it to a lamp and held it up to the light. The ink was still damp in the center of the seal, and the paper was aged with tea, not time. It was a forgery, a desperate ploy by my father to break my spirit. I tore the paper into shreds and let the wind carry it into the Thames. We were hiding in a small, windowless room in the slums of the Mint, the only place my father's guards feared to go. Zenobia was busy scrubbing the floor, a habit she couldn't seem to break, when she began to hum. It was a haunting, melancholy melody that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. I froze, the bread I was cutting falling from my hand. I knew that song. It was the Loch Hall Anthem, a private lullaby my mother used to sing to me in the nursery, a song that wasn't written down and was known only by those of the Vane bloodline. My mother had supposedly died in a scandal when I was 5, her name scrubbed from the family Bibles. "How do you know that song?" I whispered, my heart racing. Zenobia stopped humming. She stood up and walked to the corner of the room where I had kept a small, tarnished portrait of my mother I had rescued from the manor. She pointed to my mother's face, then to her own throat. She made a gesture of a key turning in a lock. I realized with a jolt of electricity that Zenobia wasn't just an Altamorn. She had been a witness to my mother's final days. My mother hadn't died of a fever. She had been hidden away, and Zenobia, perhaps as a child or a young servant, had been there. The silence between us was suddenly filled with the ghosts of two families, bound together by a secret that was beginning to scream. The Earl's final move was a legal execution of my identity. A public notice was posted in the Gazette. I was officially stripped of the Vane name, declared a civilly dead person due to my association with a traitor. We were cast out of our temporary refuge into the freezing, relentless rain of a London November. We walked toward the outskirts of the city, toward the marshes of Oswestry. I was a man who had once worn silk-lined coats and boots made of the finest calfskin. Now, my soles were worn through, and my coat was a rag. Zenobia stumbled, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the cold settled into her lungs. I stopped in the middle of a muddy lane, the wind howling around us. I sat her down on a fallen log and knelt before her. I took off my own heavy wool coat, the last thing I had of value, and wrapped it around her feet. I used the sleeves to tie the fabric tight, shielding her from the slush. I was shivering, my teeth chattering so hard I could barely speak. She looked down at me, her eyes filling with a mixture of agony and awe. I was no longer a lord. I had no title, no gold, and no future. But as I looked up at her, I realized I had never felt more noble. I wasn't protecting her because of a contract or a name. I was protecting her because she was the only truth I had left. We were two nobodies in the rain, but in that moment, we were more powerful than the Earl in his counting house. The cold eventually took its toll. By the time we reached a derelict potter's shed, Zenobia was burning with fever. Her skin was translucent, her pulse a frantic drumming against my thumb. I knew she needed quinine, a medicine far beyond the reach of a penniless exile. I took the only thing I had left, the gold locket containing my mother's hair, the one thing I had promised never to part with. I walked 3 miles to a cramped, soot-stained pawnshop. The pawnbroker, a man with eyes like black beads, looked at the locket and then at my tattered clothes. He laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "A lord's trinket for a beggar's wife," he mocked. "I'll give you a shilling, no more." The medicine cost 10. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I simply looked him in the eye and knelt on the grimy floor. "I will work your coal cellar for a week," I said, my voice steady. "I will haul the slag and break the stones. Just give me the bottle now. If I am not back to work by dawn, you can send the bailiffs." The broker stopped laughing. He saw something in my face, a desperation that was beyond fear. He slid the blue glass bottle across the counter. I clutched it like a holy relic and ran back through the snow, my lungs burning, knowing that every second I spent away from her was a second the fever was winning. I had traded my mother's memory for her life, and I knew my mother would have smiled at the bargain. 3 days of darkness passed. I sat by the small peat fire, sponging Zenobia's forehead with melted snow. On the 4th morning, just as the sun broke through the gray clouds, she stirred. Her eyes opened, and for the first time, they were clear. She sat up, her movements slow and fragile. She looked at me, then at the empty medicine bottle. She reached out and touched my throat, her hand trembling. Then, the silence of months shattered. "The ledger," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, like dry leaves skittering over stone, but it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I froze, afraid that if I moved, the dream would break. The third page, she continued, her voice gaining strength. It is not just a list of names, Peregrine. It is a map. My father did not die for the land above, but for what lies beneath it. I pulled the hidden ledger from my tunic, flipping to the third page. I had seen the list of names 100 times, but under the light of the morning sun, I saw the faint, pin-pricked holes in the parchment. When held against the firelight, the holes formed a diagram of the Larkhall estate, marking a point deep beneath the old chapel. He didn't die for gold, she said, her eyes burning with a fierce light. He died for the truth of the Queen's succession. Your father is not just a thief, he is a jailer of the throne. As Zenobia recovered, she explained the underground. It wasn't a hoard of jewels or coins. It was a vast, forgotten network of tunnels that ran from the coast of Oswestry all the way to the heart of London. During the Great War, these tunnels had been used by the Crown to move political dissidents and secret documents away from French spies. But when the war ended, my father had seized the land and turned the tunnels into a private, illegal highway. He had been moving contraband, weapons, and even people through the veins of England, bypassing all customs and laws. Zenobia's father, the king's own spy master, had discovered the treachery. He had the only set of keys to the master vaults that contained the ledger of every bribe my father had ever paid. The Vane family hadn't just stolen the Altamont land. They had murdered the only man who could prove they were the true architects of the London underworld. The keys are still there, Zenobia whispered, her hand clutching mine. Beneath the chapel where you challenged Thistlewood. My father hid them in his own tomb. I realized then that our exile wasn't a defeat. It was a journey to the heart of the enemy's power. We weren't just fighting for a name anymore. We were fighting to stop a cancer that was eating the country from the inside out. We were scavenging for firewood near the main road when a royal procession appeared, the horses' hooves muffled by the mud. It was the king himself, traveling to his coastal retreat. The carriage had broken an axle on the treacherous bend near the slums. The guards were frantic, trying to keep the curious crowd at bay. I stepped forward, my knowledge of carriage mechanics from the Vane stables coming to my aid. I can fix that, I shouted over the wind. The guards hesitated, but the king, a man of weary eyes and heavy burdens, signaled for me to approach. As I knelt to inspect the wheel, Zenobia emerged from the shadows to hand me a tool. The king leaned out of the window, his gaze falling on her face. He went deathly pale, his hand gripping the velvet curtains so hard they tore. Adelaide, he gasped, his voice a ghost of a memory. He was naming the woman from the portrait, my mother. No, he whispered, looking closer at Zenobia. The daughter, the Altamont girl. He looked at me, then at her, his eyes filling with a terrifying realization. You are supposed to be dead. Both of you. Before we could respond, the Earl's men, who had been tracking us in secret, appeared on the ridge. The king's guards, sensing a threat, hurried the king back into the carriage as the axle was kicked into place. The carriage roared away, leaving us in a cloud of dust. But the look in the king's eyes told me the game had changed. We weren't just traitors. We were a living reminder of a guilt the king himself had tried to bury. The king's recognition was our undoing. Within an hour, the Earl's Black Guard, a group of mercenaries who did the job the constables wouldn't touch, descended on the potter's shed. They didn't come with warrants. They came with clubs and heavy nets. I fought like a man possessed, swinging a heavy iron poker, but there were too many of them. They pinned me to the mud, the cold steel of a blade pressed against my throat. Watch, one of them hissed. I saw them throw a black hood over Zenobia's head. They didn't take her toward the manor. They threw her into a closed carriage and headed for the docks. She's bound for the Hesperus. The mercenary laughed, kicking me in the ribs. A one-way trip to the penal colonies in Australia. By the time you find a ship, she'll be a memory in a cage. They left me bleeding in the dirt, the sound of the carriage wheels fading into the distance. I stood up, my vision blurring, my heart a hollow chamber of ice. I didn't have a horse, I didn't have a name, and I didn't have a coin. But as I looked at the horizon, I knew I would walk across the ocean if I had to. I began to run toward the sea, the one place where a Vane, even a nameless one, knew how to fight. I reached the PU of Wapping just as the sun began to set, my lungs feeling as if they were filled with broken glass. I saw the Hesperus, a grim, black-hulled vessel, pulling anchor. The gap between the PU and the ship was widening. I didn't stop to think. I dove into the freezing, oily waters of the Thames. The cold was a physical blow, knocking the air from my chest, but I kicked with every ounce of strength I had left. I swam through the wake of the great ship, my hands clawing at the churning water. Just as my strength was about to fail, I saw a trailing mooring rope dangling from the stern. I lunged for it, my fingers catching the rough hemp, the friction burning my palms to the bone. I hauled myself up, inch by agonizing inch, as the ship hit the open sea. I climbed over the railing, collapsing onto the deck in a heap of sodden clothes and salt. I was on the Hesperus, a ship owned by my father's own company. I was a stowaway on a prison ship, heading into a storm, but I was on the same wood and iron as Zenobia. I crept into the shadows of the lifeboats, my eyes searching the barred grates of the lower deck. I would find her, or I would go down with the ship. The storm hit with a fury that turned the world upside down. The Hesperus groaned under the weight of a massive gale, the masts snapping like toothpicks. The crew was in a panic, cutting away the rigging to keep the ship from capsizing. In the chaos, I slipped down into the hold. The water was already knee-deep, smelling of bilge and fay. I found her in a row of iron cages, her hands clutching the bars as the water rose. "Peregrine!" She screamed over the roar of the waves. I fumbled with the lock, my frozen fingers refusing to work. At the same time, I saw a heavy, iron-bound chest sliding across the floorboards. It had fallen from the captain's cabin above. As it smashed against a pillar, the lid popped open, revealing the ship's logbooks, the only proof of my father's illegal smuggling and the king's involvement. The water was rising to our necks. I had to choose. I could grab the logs and ensure my father's downfall, but the chest was too heavy to carry while swimming with Zenobia. The ship gave a sickening lurch, and a wall of water crashed through the hatch. I didn't look back at the chest. I let the proof of my family's crimes sink into the dark, cold depths of the Atlantic. I threw my entire weight against the cage door, the iron groaning until it gave way. I pulled Zenobia into my arms, and together, we fought our way toward the surface as the Hesperus vanished beneath us. We washed up on a deserted sandbar, the only survivors of a ghost ship. The moon was a sliver of bone in the sky, illuminating the wreckage strewn across the sand. We sat by a small fire made of driftwood, the salt crusting on our skin. Zenobia looked at the sea, her voice quiet but steady. "I never asked for your hand, Peregrine, because I am already a ghost," she said, her eyes reflecting the dying embers. "My father wasn't just a spymaster. He was the king's true conscience. He knew that your mother didn't betray the crown. She was framed by your father to hide the fact that he was selling English secrets to the highest bidder." I listened, the world finally making sense. My father hadn't just destroyed the Altamonts for land. He had destroyed them to bury the evidence of his own treason. My mother had found out, and she had been silenced. "The keys in the tomb," Zenobia continued. "They don't just open a vault. They open a box that contains the king's own signed pardon for my family, a document your father stole to keep us in shadows." I realized that by choosing to save Zenobia over the logs, I had saved the only person who actually knew where the real truth was hidden. We were stranded, but for the first time, we were free of the lies. On the second day, a small fishing boat with dark, patched sails appeared on the horizon. It wasn't a rescue vessel, it was a marauder. As it pulled onto the sand, a man with a scarred face and eyes like flint stepped out. He carried a heavy cutlass, his gaze scanning the wreckage. When his eyes landed on Zenobia, he froze. The sword fell from his hand, burying itself in the sand. He fell to his knees, his breath hitching. "Zenobia," he whispered. She ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck. This was Philemon, her brother, whom everyone believed had died in the Altamont fire. He had spent 10 years living as a privateer, gathering a fleet of outcasts and sailors who had been wronged by the Vane shipping empire. "I have been hunting the Hesperus for months," he said, looking at me with a mixture of suspicion and respect. "I didn't think I would find you with a Vane." I stood my ground, my head held high. "I'm no Vane," I said. "I'm just a man who wants to see Larkhall fall." Philemon looked at my blistered hands and my ruined clothes. He saw the way I looked at his sister. He stood up and offered me his hand. "Then welcome to the fleet, nameless man. We have a city to take back." We returned to London not as beggars, but as a silent, deadly tide. Philemon's fleet stayed in the mouth of the Thames, while Zenobia and I infiltrated the city under the cover of a fog-heavy night. We didn't go to the manor, we went to the High Court. I used my remaining knowledge of maritime law to file a bill of attainder, a rare and dangerous legal move that allowed a citizen to sue a lord for crimes against the crown. The news hit the city like a thunderclap. The dead heir had returned with a pirate fleet and an Altamorn ghost at his side. The Earl tried to have us assassinated on the steps of the court, but Philemon's men were everywhere, blending into the crowds of dockworkers who now saw me as one of their own. We stood before the judges, Zenobia in a dress of mourning black and me in a borrowed coat. "I'm Peregrine, formerly of Vane," I announced to the hushed room, "and I charge Bartholomew, Earl of Vane, with high treason, murder, and the theft of a royal decree." The trial was set. It wasn't just a battle for land. It was a battle for the very soul of England. The night before the final testimony, a messenger arrived at our safe house. He brought no words, only a small, silk handkerchief embroidered with my mother's initials, and a fresh drop of blood. My heart stopped. My father had sent a message. He had moved my mother from the asylum to a location I would never find. "Stop the trial." The note inside the handkerchief read, "Or the woman who sang you lullabies will never sing again." I felt the walls closing in. All the legal victories, all the courage, and all the truth in the world meant nothing if it cost my mother her life. I looked at Zenobia, who saw the devastation in my face. She knew the choice I was facing. If I continued, I would be a hero to the state but a murderer of my own blood. If I stopped, the Vanes would win forever. I stood by the window, watching the moonlight hit the river. I realized then that my father's greatest weakness was that he believed everyone was as cruel as he was. He didn't realize that a man who has already lost everything has nothing left to fear. I met my father in the overgrown, shadow-choked gardens of the asylum where he was hiding. He sat on a stone bench, looking older but no less lethal. He had no lawyers with him, only 2 guards and a heavy, iron-bound box. "Sign the confession, Peregrine," he said, sliding a parchment toward me. "Sign the statement saying you coerced the girl, that the Altamonts were traitors, and that you forged the evidence. Do this, and I will let your mother and the girl live out their lives in exile." I looked at the pen, then at the man who had sired me. I felt a profound sense of pity. He was a king of nothing, sitting in a garden of ghosts. I picked up the pen and wrote, but not what he expected. I signed a document renouncing my life, my name, and any future claim to any estate in England. "I will sign your lies," I said, my voice cold as the grave, "but only if you open that box and show me the keys Zenobia's father died for." He laughed, believing he had won. He reached into the box, but as he did, I saw the signal, a flash of light from the asylum roof. Philemon's men were already inside. My mother was already being carried to safety. The courtroom was packed to the rafters. The Earl sat in the defendant's dock, his head held high, believing my signed confession would arrive at any moment to end the farce. The judges called for the final evidence. I stood up, but I didn't produce a document. I stepped aside as the doors at the back of the hall burst open. Zenobia walked down the center aisle, followed by the king's own personal guard. She wasn't carrying a confession. She was carrying the gold locket I had pawned weeks ago. Philemon had recovered it from a pawn shop, but we had found something inside that I had never seen. Within the double backing of the locket was a microletter, written on silk, bearing the king's private signet seal. It was a letter to my mother, thanking her for her silence and promising that the Altamorn line would one day be restored. Zenobia handed the locket to the queen, who sat in the royal box. The queen read the letter, her face turning to a mask of ice. She looked down at the Earl. "The king's word is a debt that must be paid," she announced, her voice echoing through the chamber. The Vane name is hereby extinguished. The Altamore name is restored. The fall of the House of Vane was swift and total. The guards moved in, stripping the Earl of his ceremonial robes right there in the dock. He was led away in chains, his face a twisted mask of disbelief. As he passed me, he stopped, his breath smelling of bitterness. "You gave up a kingdom for a girl who said nothing," he spat, his voice cracking. I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt no anger, only a vast, quiet peace. I looked at Zenobia, who was standing by the window, the sunlight finally touching her face without shadows. She didn't have to say a word. "Father," I replied, my voice steady. I finally learned how to listen, and in her silence, I found a truth you could never buy with all the gold in the world. The Earl was dragged into the darkness of the holding cells, and with him, the 300 years of vain cruelty finally ended. I stood in the empty courtroom, a man with no title and no fortune, and I had never felt more wealthy. A month later, the Wyvern estate, the true name of Larkhall, was restored to its former glory. The soot was gone, the forbidden books were returned to the main library, and the tunnels were sealed forever. I stood on the balcony, looking out at the sea where the Hesperus had gone down. I was dressed in a simple wool coat, a commoner among the nobility. Zenobia came out to join me. She looked radiant in the colors of her house. She stood beside me for a long time, watching the waves. Then, she did the one thing I never expected. She turned to me, took my hand, and she knelt on the stone. "Peregrine," she said, her voice clear and strong, no longer a whisper. "I have nothing to offer you but a name that was stolen and a heart that you found in the dark. I asked for nothing, and you gave me the world. Will you stay and build a new one with me?" I looked down at the woman who had risked everything in silence, and I didn't need a diamond to give her my answer. I didn't kneel. I simply pulled her up into my arms and didn't walk away. The story of the Vanes was over, but the story of us was only just beginning.